So they won't know who I am, but I'm the secret whisperer on this recording. And I'm going to hand over to Eilif in just a second, but I just wanted to say, on behalf of Food Systems Foresight, we're really excited to continue this conversation and very open to do some joyful learning today. So Eilif, if you'd like, you can take it from here on the agenda and lead folks into what we're going to be talking about. And I'll be here for any of the hard questions.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks, Angela. Nice to see familiar faces and new faces. I'll dive right in so that we can give enough context so we can have an interesting discussion at the end and save as much time as we can for that. So our quick agenda is to give you a little context for the project, spend the bulk digging into what we actually did with that collaborative systems mapping, and then close out with how that translated into recommendations and some reflections we have on this piece of a much larger process. And then at least 10 for discussion, hopefully more. So yeah, let's get right into it. So project context, our location, the place and space that we were looking at was the city of Kingston in New York State. Kingston was founded on the lands of the Esopus people, a Munsee Lenape Native American people. Originally, the Dutch settler colonizers came to the area, very fertile as it's part of the Hudson Valley or Hudson River watershed. Other European, sorry, I'm just gonna, oh, there we go, muted. Other settler colonizers came, it became a flourishing agricultural area. It's about 2 hours north of New York City, so it's a big food shed for the megalopolis that is New York City, and about 2 hours south of the state capital of Albany. Being on the river, it was a really big industrial hub in the late 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, and then there was a decline, a lot of suburbanization, white flight, and decline, and now a big revitalization effort. As it is the United States, there are definitely racial tensions at play. Of course, there's the conflict and the historical dispossession of the Native American peoples of the area. There's a large African American Black population that's marginalized, living in the center of the city, and a newer migrant Central American population moving in there. So a lot happening, a really rich, culturally diverse city. And here's a couple photos just to give you a little bit of flavor. So we were hired by the City of Kingston, the municipality, to develop a food systems plan to improve the resilience and food security while increasing access to nutritionally dense food for all residents of the City of Kingston over the next 10 years. Something special about this client is that she was is a registered dietitian and nutritionist. So we really had a nutrition focus right from the get-go, which isn't always the case in these kinds of efforts. To give a quick overview of this longer process, I think, if we count from proposal stage to date, it's going to end up being about 2-year process, but the bulk of the work was done in about 9 months. We took an explicit human-centered design approach to this work, so a lot of iteration, a lot of collaboration right from the jump. Designing the planning process, we looked at other food systems plan, food security plans to draw inspiration, really engage with what kinds of methods do we want to use, what kind of outputs do we want to see. What kinds of stakeholders and identities do we want to engage with? We were trying to be very intentional to pull in voices that are sometimes not heard in these processes. And we also did some boundary critique, which is where we start bumping up against systems a little bit. This was a plan or is a plan for the municipality. So in some cases, our inquiry did look just within the geographic, cartographic boundaries of the city. But being a systems plan, we're also looking beyond. So what are the farms around this area? Like, how do they interact with the city, the processors, the transport, etc. That design effort led into our kind of 2-stream process. One was engaging over 240 stakeholders, including the systems mapping. We did foresight work with exploratory scenario planning, as well as some classic focus groups. And then we also did a more desk-focused research and analysis effort. So making cartographic maps with GIS, also doing some pretty novel food flow work, which was exciting and for another webinar. Those efforts dovetailed into some final analysis, making recommendations, which we did again iteratively with clients and some key stakeholders who had the bandwidth to engage more. And now we're still in this process of validating and editing the plans, looking for that final round of consultation. But let's talk a little bit more about the systems mapping, which was one big piece of this larger effort. So our kind of starting point question with that human-centered design lens is how might we collaboratively map Kingston's food system and identify leverage points? So to give a high-level overview before I show you some more engaging pictures and scribbles, is, we started with a very simple baseline map. We chose systemogramming as our method for systems mapping. We've used this a few times before and find that it's a really light touch intro to systems mapping for the uninitiated. It's getting us out of that really reductive problem solving mode and thinking more about relationships. It's not quite as complicated as causal loop diagramming because we're not quantifying or saying, if the relationship is moving in a positive or negative way, just saying which actors, which nodes in these systems are linked. So we gave a very simple baseline, which I'll show you in a bit. We did our first workshop where we actually did the mapping, made some more detailed systemograms, took those rich scribbly chart paper outputs internally on our team and synthesized those into one map, into one systemogram. Then we had a second workshop where there was an opportunity to iterate a little bit on that map with a different group of stakeholders so to get even more inputs, even more perspectives into this effort. And then doing the work of identifying some leverage points that the city and other actors might be able to tap into. Once again, we updated that map, we synthesized the leverage points, and then we've been iteratively crafting recommendations based on the outputs from this effort and then all the other streams of analysis. So to show you a little bit more of what these nebulous gray and yellow boxes look like, as we started with this baseline systemogram, I think at first we had a more complicated version that tried to do some of that descriptive work and give a richer starting point from what we already knew, but we decided because this was the first time almost everyone in the room was doing systemogramming, to really pull back and give the simplest possible version and see what bubbled up naturally from their engagement. So systemogram looks kind of like this. You have nodes, which are the circles, and they're connected with the arrows, each of which has a verb. So producers, supply, processors up here in the top left, and so on and so forth. Also, because we have a multi-stakeholder group, this is volunteer time. We can't do a 3-day workshop, even though that would certainly be of interest to us. We only had a couple hours. We divided them into kind of sections of this baseline systemogram to focus on really fleshing out those parts. And we're pretty intentional about having some diversity in the group, but some people who are most proximate. So we had, the person running the waste collection program in that food waste and waste management section. We had some farmers in the producer space, but also processors. So we gave them this, and then we scribbled on chart paper for an hour and a bit and presented and discussed and really got into the nitty-gritty. Then I received all these images from colleagues who are based in New York, turned the diagrams into narratives. So systemograms are always part narrative and part diagram. So sentence by sentence, typed these out, looked for the overlap, the similarities, harmonized the terms where we could, and turned that into a more detailed, richer picture of the City of Kingston's food systems. So our V1 minimum viable prototype with some detail. There is a web version of this where you can zoom in and see what's on those little nodes. Systemograms aren't great for PowerPoints, unfortunately, but very useful for inquiry. So we brought this output to our second workshop, new cast of characters, trying for as diverse of perspectives as we can, both in terms of people and their role in the food system or food systems, as well as, their other sociocultural identities. We iterated a little bit, so you can see some scribbles here where people added new nodes or crossed out old ones, added new arrows and connectors between them, and then started identifying those leverage points. We gave kind of 5 options for leverage points. So things that are frozen, things that are energy, things that are mixed bag. So pushing or pulling on that leverage point could go in one direction or another. It's not very clear. And I think something interesting here, some people were really took to this quickly and understood, okay, the leverage point is something very like tangible, tactical that we could deal with. And some people went way out there and thought, climate, that's a leverage point, or just funding is a leverage point. So at this stage, because of the timing, we really tried to solicit as much input as we could, as rich of an output as we could, and then ourselves within our team and in conversation with the city, kind of sort through that and see what makes most sense to bring with us forward. that was workshop 2. And then again, we synthesized and kind of annotated our systemogram with 7 leverage points. And I'll give 3 examples here. The first is emergency food organizations, which were said to have a lot of energy, a lot of volunteers, but really stuck addressing symptoms of food insecurity, so not being able to make a systems play as much. The third one here in the bottom, institutions, which could have ripple effects as there are few actors that handle a lot of food in City of Kingston's food systems, and some differentiation between them. So schools having more energy to change, but hospitals and jails a little bit more frozen. And finally, restaurants and food service being a mixed bag that could improve food access for current residents or could help accelerate gentrification, which is a problem being so close to New York and definitely accelerating post-pandemic as there was a big flight up the river. Not jail, but actually up the physical river. So this was kind of our final output of the systemogram and the leverage points, which we brought into our recommendations phase, which I'll talk about briefly now. So we framed our recommendations overall in this report using not just the systems mapping exercise, but all the other outputs to offer up a way of working and some priority areas and strategies. This way of working, again, is grounded in our human-centered design principles that we love to marry with the systems approaches at Food Systems Foresight. So do they have a sense of the challenge or the root cause of an issue they're seeing was the place we said the city should first start. If they don't have that, then we're going to lean in, we're going to listen, we're going to engage with the community, really try and hear what's going on, get the beat of the system. For those familiar with some other complex systems work, will maybe recognize links to like probe, sense, respond. After we do the listening, we get a sense of the challenge. Then we look to solutions in the solution space. Do we have something we want to try? Do we need to co-create something? If no, let's consciously co-create. If yes, let's think about who should implement that. This was specifically a plan for the City of Kingston, so the municipal government, which in some ways has agency in their situation, but in many other ways does not, we found. So for them specifically, are they the right actor to implement the solution? Do they have the agency to do that? If so, act with agency. If not, go back into that consciously co-create space and try and crowd in other actors who do have agency to implement or make a change or push and pull one of those levers. So marrying those ways of working, those kind of 3 things we can do with 6 priority areas. These priority areas link pretty directly with the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which is a kind of global frame between cities of ways to intervene in their food system. We've tweaked and customized them for Kingston and offered about 22 strategies across these 6 priority areas for the city to consider moving forward. And to give you a little more of a taste of exactly how the systems mapping and the leverage points work showed up in our recommendations, I'll give 2 examples. The first is for each of those 6 priority areas, we linked explicitly 2 leverage points in the introduction of that priority area. So our 3rd priority, just food with equity, we called back to institutions, which were identified as a leverage point. They're very few, but they can have an outsized impact. And the many emergency food organizations, programs, and assets, which have a lot of energy or a strong base to build on in the conversation about equity. The second was a really explicit recommendation for the city to maintain their systems map. So to continue to keep track of and connect with local initiatives and movements, and to maintain this map, as well as the inventories of actors, programs, and policies that we built in another work stream of this project. So those are, some really explicit ways that leverage points showed up. Of course, there are other ways. If we think about, institutions, there were specific recommendations about, the school district and school feeding programs and how those could play a role. But so they do tie back and show up in different ways, but these are the most explicit ways they show up in that final report. And then some reflections before I turn it over to Angela to add anything I've missed and to you all to ask questions. Where did we succeed specifically in this kind of systems mapping portion? One, I think, is citizen-led identification of leverage point. There were real people who are growing, eating, processing, transporting, cooking in the food system who identify, where's their energy? Where are the places where we should look to push or pull, to prod and see if that might bring about the kind of changes we might want to see in City of Kingston's food systems. We also brought a food systems lens, which is fairly new in the Hudson Valley in the city of Kingston. There is, a longer history of looking at emergency food planning, of food access, very much like how many stores are there in the radius? Are there enough vegetables near enough the people? And less about the dynamics and the relationships between these nodes and actors and places and assets in the system. So that was a little bit new to some people. Some people really were on board right away. Some people took to it a little more slowly, a little more hesitantly. And we also did training in systemogramming across many different types of actors who we hope will bring this kind of thinking, these kinds of methods back into their organizations, as well as the city itself, who we hope will continue to do this effort on a regular basis, and perhaps even the county. We'll see. And one of our biggest successes, I think, is a really rich picture of organic waste disposal. This was already an area that had a lot of energy around it in Kingston, and a lot of people who are really, really passionate about it. So that part of our systemogram and other assets that we built was really, really strong, I think. Where do we struggle? I think everyone on this call has struggled with workshop duration. We would love all the time to really make the most rich, detailed picture and not just settle for like the minimum viable product that tells us the best thing we can in that time limit. Some of our stakeholders also struggled with that. Engaging not just the usual suspects. It's much easier to bring government folks and NGO people into a room to do a workshop than it is business owners, people who are really out there moving, selling food. We did our best, but we can always do better there. Mapping the hidden middle, and by the hidden middle, I'm talking about the midstream. This is Thomas Reardon from IFPRI, who writes about a lot. We really have a great understanding of producers, the farms, because that's a very big part of the identity of this region. We're all people who eat and buy food and are part of that end stage, even the disposal, but that middle, the processing, the transport, the wholesale, that's where there's a lot more of a blind spot, and also the actors that are harder to get in this room. So that was an area of our systemogram that was a little thinner. And then finally, jumping to solutions. A lot of our stakeholders and people who are showing up for these kinds of engagements are really, really passionate. They're leaders in their space. This is their life's work in many ways. So when we ask in that first step to just describe the system, to connect these actors, they're already thinking, oh, this is a plan with recommendations. We want to give the solutions. We have ideas. And to tap the brakes is a little bit hard sometimes, especially when you have these people who are really experts of their place. I think we managed it for the most part, but it is always a challenge to describe first and solve later. So those are some reflections. I'll hand the mic to you, Angela, and if there was anything you want to double click on or add before we open up.
I mean, I'd certainly underline that desire to jump to solutions, especially when folks didn't participate in every workshop. If they happen to have a burning idea, and we're directing them to a parking lot to write that down, because right now we're focused on just documenting, that leaves them feeling unsatisfied. And maybe they're not in the next workshop where we crack open leverage points or solutions. So that was something that was, certainly in terms of stakeholder engagement, I'd love to figure out a way to do that more effectively. Another thing I was reflecting on, we're a private sector strategy consulting collective. This was a public tender by a municipality. I'm not entirely sure if there will be the funding that was available to do this work would be available at most municipalities about the size of the city of Kingston. There were two special things going on at the time that we got the funding to do this work. One was President Biden's COVID relief funding was being pushed through the United States. And second, there's a high net worth individual who's one of Warren Buffett's sons, lives in the city of Kingston, has a huge interest in food systems, and financed half of our study. So, what I'm hearing from other municipalities is that identifying that high net worth person who's really willing to underwrite some of this exploration and learning, and not only falling into the sort of space of incentivizing immediate action, which is really the political domain. That was a nice balance. We had political capital, but we had a little bit slower, more patient philanthropical philanthropic capital to work with. So if I were talking to other cities, I would be encouraging them to think about, how might they find capital, in lots of different places to ensure it's a diverse mix of stakeholders and that they can get enough resources to do this, because it's an expensive exercise as well. And with that, I think we can open up to questions.
Thank you so much, Eilif and Angela. And please, let's give a round of virtual applause to our speakers. And my apologies personally, because I went off because of electricity problems here with a storm. But anyways, I caught, I think, most
electricity.
Yeah, basically a storm my whole... I'm still a bit in the dark, but anyways, there is electricity. So we've got questions. We got Camila and we've got Clara. So, and then we will get something from the chat. So Camila, would you like to pose your question?
Sure. So you talked about budget. I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of what the budget was or the range of that, and then also what your ideal budget would have been.
I mean, it's really hard to say what an ideal budget would have been, because that relates very much to what might be the ideal scope. We pitched in response to a public tender. So the City of Kingston had established its scope already when we sort of created a budget and went in response. I will say the project was about 9 months long, and all told, it was about $150,000 in fees and expenses that included a great deal of stakeholder outreach and engagement. That's a publicly available figure, since it's a contract with a municipality. So I'm not violating anything by sharing that figure, but 9 months is actually quite a long time to have a team deployed in a community, bringing people together, having meals, making soup, talking about food systems. So, we had certainly at times felt resource constrained there, but we're really grateful for the resources we were able to garner from the different places.
Thank you. I do have one other question, if that's allowed, or I can wait.
Please go ahead, Camila.
Okay, the other question, I know you talked a lot about what, a lot of people were excited about what solutions they can start to implement based on this. Was that part of the project, or that wasn't part of the project, or do you see anything happening as a result of that project, or people starting to work, or is there another phase of the project? Like, what is happening next, or is that kind of where you're stuck at and you don't have that answer?
Yeah.
Well, where the project is right now is that the plan has been compiled and it's been reviewed a couple of times by a set of stakeholders that we've identified. And now we will take it to the public town hall, and we'll hear from anyone who might have anything to say about the plan. And then we'll lock it down and get it approved as the city's food systems plan. And then that way of working that Eilif talked about begins. That way of moving through, as we said, we had 6 priority areas and 22 strategies. So those 22 strategies begin execution from the city, but also from other stakeholders. That's what's really important, I think, to remember about this work is the city isn't an island. It's nested within a county, and that county is nested within a state. And within that state, we have a federal government. So each layer here has an interest and some authority and some resources to command and shape. So that was probably the biggest part of the work, was understanding what's the county doing, what's the state doing. States, Governor Hochul is signing executive orders, and the county is actually writing a separate agriculture plan, which isn't integrated with the city's food systems plan. So untangling all of those different levels was certainly an interesting challenge, and one that I think anyone in this position will have going forward, because it won't be only the city that implements the recommendations and delivers on the strategies. Eilif, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to say also it's not just a straight up hierarchy of the city into the county, but you have the school district, which is separate from the city, but the boundaries mostly overlap, but not quite. So they're,
Not politically.
a horizontal, level of governments that, they control a huge amount of procurement. So this plan, which is for the city, we can say to the city, you should work with the school district to do this, but we can't recommend like the school district, you should do X, Y, and Z. So that's what's also tricky, is because a lot of those solutions are coming from people working in NGOs who need funding for their organizations or have a great idea for their organization, but that's not necessarily something that the city it's appropriate for them or possible for them to implement. So disentangling all of those ideas was part of our work and part of the city's work going forward.
Yeah, that's great. And so then you mentioned funding, like that's the question, like, is there funding to implement all of these? And I guess in some cases there is, in some cases there isn't.
Yeah.
Great. Actually, we can continue this this point. I think that in the other questions we will go back partially to the point of funding and complementing different activities, probably also different scales. For now, should we get the question of Clara? And just a note before I leave the word to Clara, Ramin, if you're still with us, perhaps you can filter one or two questions from the chat. And I see that you also have a question yourself. Clara, please.
Yes, well, thank you so much. I had a huge interest in seeing how it's done because I've tried to do it on a project that we started, the mapping part, because I worked before in systemic projects. For the mapping part, I have a lot of curiosity to know how do you choose, like, I know there's different types of mapping. You talk about like the rich picture, but like I saw you choose the most active parts, like to make that appear. How did you choose that? And also the levels, I found it difficult to decide which levels to map, because you could talk about practice between actors, or you could talk between institutions. And how did you get to choose that and to choose what to make appear? You could talk also about relations. So how do you frame that decision?
Yeah, I'll take the beginning of this, and Eilif, you can follow up. So we used systemogram, which is different than rich picture as a technically. I think Eilif did say we got a rich picture, but we didn't do rich picture as a methodology. We did systemogram, which is a natural language methodology. So you could read a systemogram like you could read a narrative. And we intentionally began with what they call the mainstay, like the most simple way you could get all the way through this system. And so that's that picture with all the colors that Eilif talked about that started at the top left and sort of narrated its way to the bottom right of the diagram, whichever way it was. That's the starting point. You asked, where did you start? We started with systemogram because it's natural language and it's the most simple that I've worked with. And then we started with a mainstay and we put that in front of people. We put that backbone of the story in front of people and asked them to elaborate. We broke them into groups and had 4 groups elaborating. So when we synthesized, our team made a decision about leveling, right? Because we were synthesizing the 4 very rough drafts, where one draft might have, my mother feeds me a sandwich, and that's, very personal at the individual level, versus the governor writes a law. Where are we? And that is always a tension that you need to navigate as a practitioner. And our team did that iteratively and in conversation. Well, first we did it in Eilif's head, and then we did it iteratively and in conversation. And Eilif, you may want to add a bit to how that process felt for you in terms of finding level.
Yeah, it was certainly challenging because I think, as I said in the reflections, the waste collection piece, we were getting a really, really rich diagram with names of actual organizations, of actual people and organizations that collect that waste. And at the process level, we're saying there's transportation, and everyone was connected to that, from like personal cars to trucks to haulers to the garbage trucks. So that level was something we had to consider. Systemograms do have guidance about how many nodes you should have on the page. or in your picture. So that was one piece of guidance. Went a little bit over the limit, but really because our boundary was the food system from production to disposal, that was kind of the limit of how much detail we went in this part of the inquiry. Which is not to say we didn't take that detail elsewhere in the project. We did. So we did a food flow exercise where, we were counting the number of actors in each one of those nodes, how many farmers are in the area, how many waste disposal. And we also did a stakeholder matrix mapping exercise. So there's a long list of every single one of those organic waste haulers. We also did some geographic mappings where we've pinned all the emergency food organizations on maps. So this demogramming is good for one look at a bigger picture, but if we want to look at like the specific actors and organizations, there were other places those showed up.
That's great. Thank you so much, Clara, for the question, and Angela and Eilif to touch upon this point. So I heard two questions so far. We really discussed about funding and how to complement funding, from different sources, and also, moving forward from what the work you have already done. And then another question, very important, thanks, Clara, about, how to engage people, drive the conversation to a specific scale or level of analysis through the use of certain tools. So I think this is something that most of us can relate, trying to engage in participatory systems mapping. So I found it very helpful. Ramin, I don't know if you're still with us, but can you, were you able to look at the chat and perhaps choose one or two questions? We have time for a couple of questions at least more.
I wonder if I can respond to one that Ramin typed, which is about considerations for keeping space. And this was an important consideration from the beginning. So we identified an NGO that owned a house in the city that we were working in, and had our stakeholder engagement in that house. So we were in a neutral place that had a kitchen and dining room tables and fireplaces and comfort and yoga mats and books. And it allowed us to create an intimacy for conversation that I thought was really, really beneficial to the outcome. We had outdoor space, so it was lovely. That was one of the highlights, certainly, of the overall setup. We tried to never go more than half a day, and we tried to feed people as well. That was really important. So we had, in some situations, we had catered meals. In other situations, we made meals together, and that was really important for the conversation. One of the most rich stakeholder interviews of my career happened through this work, where I got to sit down with Native American elders and feast on the foods that they made and brought, and bring some of our own foods together and talk with them about the history of food systems and their role in food systems of the future. And it was absolutely mind-blowing and so much more important and special because we were doing it at a table around food. So it was a really great aspect of this work.
Thanks so much, Angela. I think it was a very important point, because the space for leading this conversation actually makes a lot of a difference. There is certain material conditions around where we map that can make a difference. So it's super important to pay attention to those. And while you were responding, I also had the time to look at some of the questions, not in depth as I wished, but I think there is a very interesting question from Lauren. Lauren Perkins, if you are with us, Lauren, would you like to ask your question? There is some points on food sovereignty that I would like to.
I think it says not in a place to use camera or mic.
Okay. I see. Yeah, you're right. You see,
no way.
Anyways,
we can certainly talk a little bit about that. So yeah, we were, this was on the heels of, a Black Lives Matter conversation. This is on the heels of I think an awareness in the United States around land acknowledgement, and really trying to increase our overall awareness of the history of the land that we are asked to steward in this life. And so food sovereignty was, I would say, broadly part of the conversation. It was not a central objective of the city, of the elected official who ultimately commissioned this work, but the idea of food as an opportunity to bring together the various vulnerable populations in the city, the mayor and team were very, very interested in doing. So I know, Eilif, if you want to add to that at all, gentrification was the hardest story, but bringing in a diversity of cultures and food histories was kind of the highlight. So we got to do a bit of both.
Yeah, I think, part of the explicit ask from the city and colleagues there, and something we also use in projects is taking an asset-based approach. Because a lot of the work in this region and the United States is about, where are the poor, racialized, hungry populations, and how do we do something right there? This is the case in Kingston as well. So, in some of our public engagements, we brought our systemogram, we brought our geographic map of the city, and everybody's pointing to this one neighborhood. They're saying Rondout, there's people of color there, there's no grocery stores, there's poverty, there's need for food stamps, which is really important and part of our recommendations and part of the analysis, but also, okay, there's a problem, there's a challenge here. How do we bring that together with knowledge of these community elders, of this new Latin American population, of institutions that are around here that are engaging with food? We have the Culinary Institute of America just down the road, who are coming into this space, starting to be entrepreneurs, open food businesses. How do we bring those populations together around food to bring good jobs, to ensure we have housing, and to my personal agenda is to decenter the car a little bit in the American city, but that's a bigger task than we could have in this plan. But yeah, equity, just food with equity is priority area 3, and specific call outs to marginalized, racialized identities do appear in the other 6 sections as well. But gentrification, huge issue that I don't think food alone will solve.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Eilif. I think this component is super important because, of course, embedding this food systems analysis into the broader societal issues is absolutely fundamental. And often in this work, when doing this work, I'm always struggling with understanding to what extent we can focus on food without looking at the broader social or ecological context where we are operating. But of course, also this exercise requires focus, right? So it's quite of a trade-off. I see a number of other questions that from Sebastian, Sander, Beth, and Camila. And I'll give the word to Sebastian in a second, probably for our last question. And I think that there is a lot of interest around how you are moving from the current work that you have done with this funder in this city to what can be done next in terms of making this systems mapping work as part of a broader process. So I think that perhaps is something that that we can reflect, or you can respond together with getting a question from Sebastian, because perhaps he has a more specific point that he would like to make. Sebastian, I give you the word.
Thank you, Domenico. Thank you, guys. Very, very, very inspirational. First of all, systemograms. I was looking it up because I'm quite familiar with systems mapping. I've never heard that term, and I'm not surprised that Ramin shared something from Nkosi. So I'd be curious, why do you use that method that comes from systems engineering for a process that is very much a soft systems approach, where I would tend to see a rich picture approach of what you described goes into that direction. My main question, though, is your framing question. I heard a what if question, and I wasn't quite sure how that relates to what the brief of the city was, and I'd be also curious what that benefactor you mentioned, Angela, what his expectations were, and basically how those expectations were met. Unpack that in every way you want. So that might be a big one. Thank you.
I'll start in the middle a little bit on this, how might we? And I think this would have been one of many how might we questions that our team asked ourselves over the course of this engagement. It's not the framing question of the engagement. So those designers out there who are like, this is not a proper how might we question because it's got the answer baked in, I feel you. This was more a how might we map kind of framing question. So that gets to your first point, Sebastian, which is why systemogram. One, it's a mapping methodology that I've used for years, and so I feel most comfortable with it. And ultimately, when we're taking something out to stakeholders, we want them to sense our comfort. We want them to believe that they can do it too. And we want it to feel good and easy and approachable. And so I like systemogram because it achieves those things. When I sit down with someone and say, we're going to draw a circle and a line to another circle, and then we're going to read the words that are on the circle, the line, and the circle, and that will be a sentence that makes sense to you. I can turn it into language, I can turn it into a picture, and I can do analysis on language a lot more easily, right? I can understand it, like Eilif was talking about, it makes it easier to synthesize. So because we're not trying to win a systems mapping award in this work, we're trying to hear what the stakeholders believe to be the important aspects and dynamics of their system. And we just want to capture it so we can, move quickly and have something to reflect on and identify leverage points. We wanted to use the one that was easiest to get to, the easiest to go from you've never even thought about mapping a system to look, you just mapped a system in 4 short hours. So it's a real tough ask. And I think systemogram lends itself just to that ease of use. And sure, it definitely is incomplete, as are absolutely all the models we will ever make. So yeah, thanks for your question. And the funding from Novo Foundation, which is not Novo of the Nordics, but just Novo because that's what he called it, is actually one of the sons of Warren Buffett, and he is continuing to fund this process, but waiting for, I think, the mayor and the city itself to go through its required approvals.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, to conclude, I think it would be very interesting to just hear what is next for you in this domain, both in the county or more broadly. Like, are you applying this this approach to other cities, and how are you doing it similar or different in other contexts that you may be working in?
Yeah, so we are trying to make systems mapping and foresight sort of really speak to each other in a lot of work that we're doing. So we've got a process for rapid scenario planning or exploratory scenario planning that's also very participatory with stakeholders. So what we're doing is doing some high-level mapping and then bringing that into conversations where we're doing scenario planning. An example would be the work we recently did with the World Food Program, where we brought together representatives from business, government, and society across 9 countries in the Amazon, all came into Belém in Brazil to build scenarios for the potential future food systems for the Amazon basin. And it was fascinating to do that work, but to start off from a basic understanding of the food system of interest using a very simple diagram like a systemogram to get those stakeholders all on the same page. And this beautiful, beautiful thing that's on the screen right now was made for me by one of the native elders that came to our consultation, and it is such a prized possession. It's really stunning. So thanks for sharing that picture, Eilif.
Of course. And I'm trying to figure out how to do systemogramming and systems mapping in my master's thesis soon. So TBD, but excited to continue to engage with this group and maybe pick up some interesting methods there. But I think that's our time.
That's fantastic. It's great that you just shared your emails here. And I know that Camila was asking, is there a case study or more information, conversations, etc., we can access? So if you'd like to share anything else, like a link, or if you would like to just redirect us, the interested people, to somewhere, please use the chat.
Yeah,
or
I mean,
let
I
us
think
know.
it's a time thing, right? Because once this is approved by the city, we will be happy to share it publicly. So we'll come back to this group and share it in that way. And we can also keep you posted because it's an interesting case that we're talking with lots of folks about. So if we do ever package it in some way that's more digestible, we'll also share that with this group because I know there's not millions of cases out there where you see practitioners using these tools.
Excellent. Congratulations, Angela and Eilif. And we will be looking forward to the report once it's approved. Thank you so much.